Murder most foul. The best-selling children's author slowly poisoned, suffocated and buried in a cesspit.
On suspicion of the murder of Helen Bailey.
Are you joking?
Do you understand that?
I guess so.
Good evening. The moment of Ian Stewart's arrest. He had met the successful children's author Helen Bailey on a bereavement website. Today at St Albans Crown Court, Stewart was found guilty of her murder. The details of his fiancée's suffering and killing are horrible. Police say they are now looking into the death of his first wife in 2010.
Also tonight, what is the price of love? According to the Supreme Court, it is still £18,000. Money that Paul Macmillan, a trainee doctor, doesn't make, which means that his American partner, Megan Richter, doesn't have the right to live with him.
Explaining it to her and explaining it to her family and her friends in the USA, in many ways it makes me ashamed to be British.
The price of famine is measured in lives, but also aid. The British government is giving £100 million to oil-rich South Sudan, where 100,000 face starvation because of man-made conflict. And the limits of diplomacy North Korean style. The Malaysian police want to question the number 2 at the North Korean embassy as authorities report an attempted raid on the mortuary containing the body of Kim Jong-nam.
Also tonight, Doris Day. No, not the late Hollywood star, but tomorrow's weather bomb. Orkney had a taste of her overture today, but she'll escape the full blast tomorrow. We'll be reporting on what the rest of us can expect when Doris's skirts really billow. She was a best-selling author who thought she had found a second chance at love. But today, the fiancé of Helen Bailey, who she'd met online via a bereavement website, was found guilty of her murder. Ian Stewart suffocated his 51-year-old fiancée before hiding her body in a cesspit in order to get his hands on her multi-million-pound fortune. Today, police announced they were examining the death of Stewart's first wife, Kemi Zeram, is live outside St Albans Crown Court.
Good evening, John. Yes, Ian Stewart will probably spend the rest of his life behind bars, as you say, convicted today of the murder of successful author Helen Bailey. His motive, according to the judge, her wealth. He was, according to her, she described him as her gorgeous, grey-haired widower, but he apparently had other ideas and embarked on a complex plot to drug her, to suffocate and smother her before trying to conceal her body in a cesspit in his garage before his story began to unravel.
Arresting you on suspicion of the murder of Helen Bailey.
Are you joking?
3 months after his fiancée went missing, barefoot and in dressing gown, Ian Stewart feigns innocence.
We're going to have a full discussion about this. Oh, the garage door's open.
Police had opened his garage door because they'd found the hidden cover to a cesspit that he'd used to try and dispose of Helen Bailey's body, a famous author.
My name's Helen Bailey, and I'd like to introduce you to my new book.
And widow who'd written and blogged extensively about grief.
Subtitled Life After Death and a Dog Called Boris.
When police finally searched the garage to the rear of this £1.5 million detached house, they found her body several feet underground, next to that of her dog, in a Victorian cesspit. Police still don't know whether she was buried unconscious and alive.
Both Stewart and Ms. Bailey were widowed and had met via a support group. They bought a house together. But Stewart wanted her money. He began drugging her with his prescription sleeping medication. And on the day he killed her, neighbours noticed unusual activity in the garage.
I did hear a lot of opening and shutting of the back door on that Monday morning, which was unusual. It was so unusual that I got up to look.
You wait 4 days to report her missing. You're vague about your movements on the 11th at best.
His story was inconsistent from the start. CCTV caught him taking what's thought to be a duvet to the dump on the very day she went missing. when he also began taking money from her bank account.
Financially, you would have benefited from her death, would you not say?
Stuart's grown-up sons left court without comment today, knowing their father has been convicted of murder and perverting the course of justice.
He must be a particularly wicked individual. He's lived with Helen Bailey for a number of years. He purported to love her. He purported that he was going to marry her. And yet not only can he kill her, but then he can dispose of her body into a cesspit and then lie not only to the police, but her family, his family.
Tonight, Hertfordshire police confirmed they're now also looking into the death of Stuart's former wife, Diane, who died after having an epileptic fit in 2010. Stuart will be sentenced tomorrow for the murder of Helen Bailey, a widow who thought she'd found new love.
Now, police have stressed that they're duty-bound to look again into the death of Diane Stewart, his former wife, but that at the moment, at least, Ian Stewart is not a suspect, and this is not a fresh murder investigation. They just need to be sure of any potential similarities between the death of his former life and that of Helen Bailey. But it is not going to be a straightforward inquiry. Bailey, who was an epilepsy sufferer all her life, died suddenly in 2010, and then her body was cremated. So this is not a straightforward matter by any means.
Clement Zerem reporting. Now, after a succession of doom-laden headlines, the Prime Minister today said help would be available for firms hardest hit by the rise in business rates this April. Some shop owners claim they would face hikes of up to 400%. Labour has questioned whether any new money is actually available. Our business correspondent Helia Ibrahimi has the story.
When Napoleon called Britain a nation of shopkeepers, he meant it as an insult, but it soon became a symbol of national pride, something today's shopkeepers claim this government has forgotten. For Ian Cole, running his Polish cafe in South London is becoming more and more difficult as his tax bill gets increasingly expensive.
We're facing a rise in business rates of 30%, and that's going to hurt us, and we're going to have to raise our prices in order to pay these additional taxes, and that's where it's going to come from. It's not going to come from thin air. It has to come from the people who are paying for a meal.
While his restaurant is only just turning a profit, Ian's cafe is one of thousands of British companies now facing a hike in business rates, something he says is deeply unfair.
This tax is insane right now. The problem is that most of us believe we should be contributing to the local areas in which we do business. So in other words, a tax that goes to local authorities is good, but it should be based on revenues, not on the value of a property that I don't even own.
But in Westminster, there seemed to be confusion about the official response. The outcry has been deeply embarrassing for a Conservative government who claim to be the party of small business. And while the Prime Minister said there was already a fund in place to help struggling companies, the Communities Secretary seemed to go further and promise reform in the upcoming budget.
Now, growing up above the family shop, I saw for myself the impact an increase in rates can have on small businesses.
But with growing pressure from his own backbenchers, the Communities Secretary had to serve up more than just nostalgia.
It's clear to me that more needs to be done to level the playing field and to make the system fairer. I'm working closely with my right honourable friend, the Chancellor, to determine how best to provide further support to businesses facing the steepest increases. We expect to be in a position to make an announcement at the time of the budget in just 2 weeks' time.
The question bricks and mortar companies will be asking is, does today's back and forth actually add up to any new money? The Prime Minister's press office put out a rather odd announcement stressing the shared strategy with Mr Javid. But critics suggested the contradictory messages at the dispatch box earlier were a result of overzealous news management by Number 10.
Helia Ibrahimi reporting. Now, the Supreme Court has backed the government's minimum income rule for Britons wanting to bring a non-European partner or children to the United Kingdom. The court said having to prove annual earnings of at least £18,600 did not breach human rights. But judges accepted the rule had brought significant hardship to many thousands of families. Our senior Home Affairs correspondent Simon Israel has this report.
Paul Macmillan met his American girlfriend Megan in Canada 4 years ago, the year the government began clamping down on foreign spouses and family reunions from abroad. He's now a first-year medical student in Glasgow. She's an experienced, qualified social worker. But they can't be together in Scotland because he doesn't earn enough.
Explaining it to her and explaining it to her family and her friends in the USA, in many ways it makes me ashamed to be British, that we have such a xenophobic immigration system. My partner, who's American, can't come and live in Britain. It's ridiculous.
The main hurdle to thousands of couples like them is the financial bar. From 2012, Britons have had to earn more than £18,600 before a husband or wife from outside the European Economic Area can settle in the UK. This rises to £22,400 if the couple have a child who does not have British citizenship. These restrictions have led to an estimated 15,000 children living in the UK with only one parent, while applications for spouse visas have dropped 20% in the last 5 years.
Many families had pinned their hopes on today's Supreme Court case, but the judges accepted the financial bar in principle is lawful, while acknowledging it's brought significant hardship to many and is a serious obstacle to enjoying family life. The rules, it said, had to change to take more account of the impact on children.
The Home Office see the judgment as an endorsement of its efforts to reduce immigration and its impact on the state, but accepts rules will have to change and some refusals reviewed. But campaigners which brought the case are also claiming victory.
It is completely wrong to say this is a carte blanche victory for the government. No, not at all. Children have succeeded, families have succeeded, and what's more, the income threshold, the way it's calculated, has been opened up in order to protect families, and that is a significant victory for families, a significant victory.
These hurdles have led to the UK being described as the least migrant family-friendly state of 38 countries in the developed world. Paul Macmillan feels he's experienced that firsthand. His student loans cannot be used to help meet the financial threshold. His only hope is that his partner's savings may, as a result of today's ruling, be seen as alternative funding.
So at present she's working long hours to save up as much as she possibly can to potentially try and help us satisfy the government's thirst for discriminating against foreign citizens coming to live in the UK with British citizens.
If that doesn't work, the medical student says he's resigned to graduating in 4 years, but then leaving to practice medicine in the States for a life with the woman he loves.
Now, from the House of Commons, we're joined by Labour MP Naz Shah, who sits on the Home Affairs Committee, and the Conservative MP and former Northern Ireland Secretary Theresa Villiers. I suppose, Theresa Villiers, the best way we can sum up the Supreme Court's decision is legal but unpleasant.
I wouldn't describe that. I wouldn't use that term to describe the decision. I think it was sensible, and it acknowledged that it's reasonable for a state in determining its immigration policy to require that people bringing spouses to live in this country are able to support them independently of the welfare system. I don't think that's unreasonable. I think many people across the country will think that this is a sensible approach by the government, which has been endorsed as human rights compliant by the Supreme Court today. So the Supreme Court was wrong to talk about sort of significant hardship being affecting the children in these marriages, and indeed that the family had come very secondary to the issue of controlling immigration. Well, what I said was the Supreme Court's judgment was a sensible one in supporting the income requirement, but I also think it's welcome that there will be a reassessment of the role of children, and I've no doubt the government will look again at the rules to make it absolutely clear that the interests of children are going to be taken into account. I'm sure they are in the present system, but clearly the judgment means that the rules will have to be changed to ensure that that is much clearer, and I think that's perfectly sensible.
Well, that's quite a candid admission that it is bad for children and not very good for the family either.
The Supreme Court said that the rules needed to make it clearer that the interests of children were to be a primary consideration. Now, I happen to believe that the current system does take into account the interests of children, but clearly further clarity is going to be required, and the rules will need to be updated to take that into account to comply with the judgment. But
well, let me bring in Naz Shah, because, I mean, there is, of course, another way of looking at this, and that is that in some way the government saw the real priority to try to get immigration numbers down to the tens of thousands as they promised.
Absolutely, John. So the government took the view that we could reduce immigration. They knew at the time of bringing in this policy that 45% of spousal applications would not meet that threshold, and then they went about it the whole wrong way. So they put the spousal the threshold in first, making sure that 45% couldn't reach that threshold, which is discriminatory in itself. It doesn't take into account cost of living. It doesn't take into account, you know, what this gentleman has just said. The chap who's been on, who's talking about his American wife. I've had a constituent of mine who is from America. Again, the kind of bureaucracy, the kind of rules that apply, that people have to consistently...
Yeah, but I mean, in a sense, we have to work out whether, in fact, the government was right indeed to try to get the numbers down. Are they right indeed to get the numbers of immigration down?
Immigration control, whilst it is a necessity, penalising those people who want to be here as part of their family is wrong. Separating families, 15,000 children we're talking about, being raised in families. So, and they don't take into account multiple incomes. So if somebody has a £60,000 income from multiple strands, they won't take that into account. It is just a way of controlling the numbers, because this government clearly has no idea and has no control on immigration at all.
Well, but I'm still getting at the question, which is, if you want to get immigration down, one way to do it is, in fact, simply to allow the workers in, and only to allow spouses and children to come in once their wages get to a point where they can support them.
But even those wages that we're expecting, 18,600, isn't what we would require of somebody living in Bradford West, for example, to be able to raise a child. That's not the expectation we'd have. When the threshold was 13,000, just over 13,000, it was much more reasonable. It was just above the living wage. For a single parent to have to work, have a child, and perhaps take child tax credits into account, that wouldn't be taken into account in this instance. So no, it does penalise. It penalises those that actually, so constituents like mine in Bradford West, cost of living is very different.
Well, let me put
London.
that point to Teresa Villas. I mean, it is a fair point that in different parts of the country, different levels of money would be needed to sustain a family and indeed a wife. I mean, to sort of cast, for example, what you'd need in London in Bradford, for example, would be wrong. Would you agree?
But the Supreme Court was clear that not only was the principle of a minimum income threshold justifiable, but so was the actual number chosen by the government. It wasn't just sort of dreamed up. It was based on research from the Migration Advisory Committee. So that has had some endorsement. You've got to draw a line somewhere.
Well, now, Shah, I can see you don't agree.
Well, so for me, the key is the principle of this decision. It is not morally. Principally, having a legal decision does not make it morally and ethically right.
But with respect, that's not the argument you were pursuing. You were pursuing the idea that it was wrong to put a level that might be manageable in London but wasn't required for living in Bradford.
No, actually, it's both, John. I absolutely disagree with the way this government has put that level income. It doesn't take into account living standard. It doesn't take into account local demographics, local jobs, etc., local skill sets, where if it's for a constituency like Bradford West, it's much more harder. So we've got those challenges, but
okay,
it also is ethically wrong.
The big question then, Teresa Villas, can the government actually now get it right, having got it wrong?
Well, the government has largely got it right. The key principle of an income requirement has been endorsed by the Supreme Court. I'm sure the government will take action to deal with the issue on children and alternative sources of income. And I believe it's perfectly possible for them to come up with a system which is compliant and remedies the defects identified by the Supreme Court today.
OK, Teresa Villas, Naz Shah, thank you very, very much for joining us. Matt.
Thanks, John. Now, Cressida Dick, a former head of counter-terrorism, has been appointed the new Metropolitan Police Commissioner. She will be the first woman to take charge of the force and will effectively become the country's most powerful police officer. Well, our chief correspondent, Alex Thompson, is here. Alex, tell us more.
Well, yes, effectively, unquestionably, she'll be the most powerful police officer. And extraordinary times. We now have the three most senior positions in British policing, all filled by women. That's the Chief Constable's Organisation, National Crime Agency, and, of course, the Met. I suppose we should add in, of course, the other figure in all this, the Home Secretary, Amber Rudd, also a woman. So, appropriately enough, it was with Amber Rudd that Cressida Dick faced the cameras to express her joy about getting the job. This is what she had to say.
I could not be more pleased to be appointed as the Commissioner. It's beyond my wildest dreams, an extraordinary privilege. I am very humbled. I adore London. I think it's the world's greatest global city. And I love policing and I love the Met.
So, Alex, she loves the Met. Not everyone loves her.
Indeed. Well, an endorsement for the job as you'd expect there. But rightly or wrongly, there's no question, the name Cressida Dick will, at the moment, be fixed in the public mind with one thing and one thing only. I'm sure that is a bit unfair given her long career in policing. And it is, of course, the events surrounding this man. We've got some pictures here now in memorial of the young Brazilian man back in 2005, Jean-Charles de Menezes, shot dead by the police on an operation which Cressida Dick commanded because they thought, wrongly of course, he was a suicide bomber. Now, she was exonerated. The police had crossed the line and made some blunders in terms of other areas, but she was exonerated from that operation. The family have not forgotten. This is a statement their solicitor put out today. Have a look at these words. And I think they really underline for you the kind of remaining hurt and grief which the family feel and feel still to this day let down by the police force. But, of course, huge job for the Met, the perennial problems, the 3 M's, money, morale, manning, internally, externally, all the gamut of crime, but in the modern age, Al-Qaeda, IS and, of course, cybercrime.
Alex, thanks. John?
The government has pledged a total of £200 million to help people facing starvation in South Sudan and Somalia. Famine has been declared in 2 areas of South Sudan, which has been stricken by civil war for the past 3 years. This comes as UNICEF warns 1.5 million children's lives are at risk in famines across 4 countries, threatening to overwhelm aid agencies. Some of the images in Jonathan Rugman's report are distressing from the very start.
Parts of South Sudan are in famine, the world's first since 2011. Over 250,000 severely malnourished children, says UNICEF. Almost 3 million people forced from their homes because of ethnic conflict here, massacres and widespread rape as weapons of war. So with people otherwise forced to live off plants and brackish water, the UK is sending in £100 million of aid, on top of the hundreds of millions British taxpayers have already spent. And all the aid agencies admit that this famine is man-made. Those men are Salva Kiir, the president, wearing the hat, and Riek Machar, his former deputy. Their power struggle means that while their followers are busy fighting, Britain is paying the food bill of over 500,000 people. Though even the British minister in charge doesn't sound sure the aid will arrive where it's needed most.
We will work with the government in that sense to make sure that we can challenge them to get access in terms of food aid, to get the humanitarian system working. But also we need long-lasting political solutions in these countries, and that's why we need to do that and work together with the international community.
For a less diplomatic assessment, listen to this former minister on how South Sudan's leaders outsource starvation as an issue for us rather than them.
I met one of the finance ministers for South Sudan at the UN in New York, and I said, look, if this war continues, you are going to find your people are starving because you're diverting all these resources. He said to me, that's fine, we'll feed the army. I said, well, that's one part of it, but what about the people? He said, you will feed the people. Well, what do you mean, we will feed the people? He said, I don't believe that countries like Britain will walk away whilst hundreds of thousands of people starve, so we'll carry on fighting the war.
But aren't you effectively saying they've got us over a barrel, that we are now having to pay £100 million in aid to South Sudan to allow them to carry on fighting?
Actually, I mean, much as it sticks in your gullet, the truth is that about a month later, in my DFID box, I was having that as a Foreign Office conversation, in my DFID box, sure enough, there was a decision to make about spending, at that time, about £100 million on aid to stop people from starving. And I took the decision to spend the money because I think that is actually, you know, something that Britain can do. But the leaders are despotic and disgusting. President Kiir and Mashar are, frankly, if I may speak frankly, two of the worst people I've ever met in my life.
Mr Shapps is not arguing for DFID's controversial £12 billion aid budget to be cut. Part or all of the 4 countries now on the brink of famine once answered to Whitehall. Now Whitehall answers to their hungry people.
This is aid that will go directly to people who are in need. But absolutely, absolutely, there is a huge responsibility on all sides, whether it's in the conflict in South Sudan or in Yemen, or indeed on those committing atrocities in northern Nigeria, to stop what they're doing, to get back around the table for peace talks and to let their people live in peace and security. But we have a moral responsibility in the meantime not to see hundreds of thousands of people die.
The UK is also sending 400 troops to a UN mission in South Sudan this spring, mostly engineers working in refugee camps and building a hospital for injured soldiers. Though it's a possible moral quagmire if British troops witness violence against civilians and fail to stop it. But confronted with this suffering, doing nothing is not an option. And for those arguing that aid needs to be tied to political reform, what an appalling example South Sudan is.
Jonathan Rugman. Well, earlier I spoke to Jock Maddock Jock, the former culture minister in South Sudan, and I began by asking him if the president and his rebel counterpart are responsible for making this famine a man-made disaster.
To a large extent, it is related to, it is due to this ongoing conflict, 3 years and plus running war. But there is a bit of it that is also environmental, in the sense that last year the harvest was very poor due to inadequate rainfall.
I guess the question is that if we feel morally obliged, as we have done today, to help the people who are suffering from famine by sending £100 million in your direction, when will those two leaders, when will the two tribal factions feel morally obliged to stop this disaster from occurring in the first place?
Definitely. There is the moral obligation and the constitutional obligation lies more squarely with those leaders before it is the responsibility of any other party in the world. So there is no question that the responsibility is definitely belonging with those leaders. The government of South Sudan yesterday declared that there is threat of famine and that there has to be a plan of action to prevent a disaster.
So what would you say to someone in Britain who is basically prepared to give money to South Sudan to help people avoid famine and starvation? What would you say to them if they asked you about the nature of this conflict and the fact that it was mainly man-made? What would your response be to them?
Well, the response is that that while we know some of the political responsibility behind this conflict, the fact is that these ordinary South Sudanese who have nothing to do with the conflict just have to be rescued. And it is the responsibility of every human being, outside or inside, to ensure that these people don't die through this famine.
Okay, we've got to leave it there. Jock Maddock, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. Good day.
Well, joining me now is Andrew Mitchell, the former International Development Secretary from Westminster. Thanks for coming on the programme, Andrew Mitchell. So, you heard it in the report. While they're busy fighting, we're paying the food bill of 500,000 people suffering potentially from starvation. That is very difficult to justify, isn't it?
Well, I think it's a massive oversimplification. It is true, of course, that South Sudan has not the transition from being a state or part of a state which is war fighting, and the leaders of the military have not transformed themselves into a government, and we are living with the consequences of that. But let's be clear, the people who we are trying to help there, they are in this position through no fault of their own, and common humanity means we should be going to help the poor people who are starving in South Sudan, and indeed in northeastern Nigeria and Yemen and Somalia. And it is appalling that in this year, the 2017, we have a biblical famine starting in all 4 of these countries, a situation we haven't seen for the last 20 years, and we never thought we would see again. And of course, Britain with its leadership on international development, along with other countries, must now go to help the poor and innocent people in these countries who are going to die in very large numbers unless the international community galvanizes itself.
So there is a moral obligation here, and I think a lot of people would accept that, but to what extent can one use that moral obligation and the money that is flowing in that direction as leverage in order to try and stop this conflict, which is the original reason for the famine, from continuing?
Well, of course that is right, but we are trying to do that. We and the Norwegians and the Americans, we do a great deal to try and improve the political situation in South Sudan. Although it is not going terribly well, it is a uniquely difficult situation because these war fighters who now run the government have not transformed themselves in the way that I said earlier into a government. But Britain and America have influence on the ground there, Norway too, the European Union. All of those forces need to try and ensure that governance, basic governance, is built. But that is very separate, if I may say so, to the issue of feeding starving people who find themselves in this position through no fault at all of their own.
But the question is, does aid, whether we like it or not, perpetuate the cycle of conflict and violence? Because it allows the soldiers to carry on fighting while we feed the people.
Well, they are two separate issues, if I may say so. We have to try and stop the fighting, broker a ceasefire. One of the reasons why Britain is sending 400 United Nations peacekeepers there is to try and intensify that political process. But in my view, it is quite wrong to say that because there's fighting going on and that is the fault of the leaders' inadequacy in that country, the poor people who are there should suffer and should starve to death. We have to do both things. We have to try and get a political ceasefire and a political process going, and also help the poor suffering people who, as I say, without that help will die in their thousands if the international community is not now able to get food and medicines and basic materials to them.
Let me ask you another question. There was a suggestion in the Sunday Times this weekend that Boris Johnson and Michael Fallon might want to use some of the £12 billion aid budget, annual aid budget, towards Eastern Europe, countries like Poland or Hungary or perhaps the Baltic states, in order to buy a better deal for Brexit. What do you make of that?
Well, first of all, the rules governing the use of British aid are very clearly laid down and they cannot be changed. And the British Treasury, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, will never allow money to be taken from the budget and not used in accordance with those rules. Otherwise, the Treasury would have to find extra money to meet the commitment on point 7. But it is true that some aid and development money from Britain, as part of the European Union's efforts on development, do go into building infrastructure in parts of the European Union and in countries just beyond it.
But the Dutch have come across this problem with the OECD, and they've basically decided to spend the budget as they see fit. So we could do the same, couldn't we?
No, because with the commitment of the government in the general election, and the commitment indeed of Parliament, is not only for the budget, which is the point 7, it's also for the way the budget is spent. And those rules are very clearly laid down by the OECD Development Assistance Committee. That consists of more than 30 countries. Those rules will not easily be changed. And unless they are changed, it is not possible to spend it in a different way.
All right, got to leave it there. Andrew Mitchell, thank you very much.
Thank you.
John.
Amnesty International has said that what it describes as the poisonous rhetoric of Donald Trump has made the world a darker, more unstable place. In its annual report, the charity also warned that human dignity and equality were coming under assault from a wave of populist politicians seeking election. Diana Magni has this report.
This time last year, a forlorn but familiar sight on Europe's shores. The debris of flight and survival discarded, old lives left behind. Regime barrel bombs rained down on Syria's cities, forcing thousands more to flee. The bloodiest manifestation of a refugee crisis which stretches far beyond Syria and sows nationalist fears across the world. In the US, an unlikely presidential contender slates in a tweet the man he'll duly replace. As candidate, Donald Trump was a master at the politics of division.
We're going to build that wall, don't worry about it.
And as president, nothing's changed. His Twitter feed, an education in vitriol, the dignity of his office notwithstanding.
We want unity through truth and justice. No more lies, no more blame, no more hate.
In its annual report, Amnesty International today charts what it calls a politics of demonization, spread by the likes of Trump with potentially devastating consequences for human rights.
I think the ripple effects of what the US is doing, we've only barely scratched the surface, not only of what President Trump seems willing to do, but what others will do as a response or reaction to that, or see as the US giving them almost permission to do.
The choice is in your hands.
It's 1 year too since David Cameron announced the referendum, the path that ends in Brexit that's polarised opinion, and that many feel has opened the lid on hate speech. The most tragic expression of that hatred, the murder last June of Jo Cox, killed by a far-right extremist. She campaigned passionately for human rights and for the suffering of those in Syria.
On refugees, given the escalation of the violence in Aleppo and the lack of medical care available there now, what further can the UK do to get the most vulnerable people out of harm's way?
She taught us that we cannot bring peace by turning our backs on each other.
And yet, does the political tone need to shift? Or is it more that a liberal elite can't accept the realities of a populist revolution? And yet the hate speech continues against Gina Miller, who brought the Article 50 case, who's received numerous death threats, against Shadow Home Secretary Diane Abbott, who said last week the racist and sexist abuse she gets would make her think again about becoming an MP today.
To win our trust, to protect everyone.
Amnesty calls 2016 the year of us against them. So how to shift the tide?
Outrage is not enough.
Well, as we've been hearing, the murder of MP Jo Cox was highlighted by Amnesty. Her husband, Brendan, is hoping to build bridges in divided British communities by announcing special events to mark the first anniversary of his wife's death. On the weekend of the 17th and 18th of June, he hopes people will come together in the biggest community celebrations since the Queen's Diamond Jubilee. I met him earlier and began by asking whether in the months since his wife's death, time has been any kind of healing.
I think it's probably still too early for time to have had that effect, partly because of the nature of this, the suddenness and obviously the horror of it. I think it just takes longer to sink in. I think the shock is more pronounced, and so there's still definitely days when I still feel quite numb to it. There's days when it sinks in much more deeply, whether it's a smell or just a memory or an item of clothing. There's just things that bring it back in a way that you don't expect. The things that you can plan for are in like the anniversary in some ways easier because you can plan for them. It's often those unexpected things that knock you sideways a bit.
Are those the moments when you find yourself texting?
I tend to find myself texting Jo when I've come out of a meeting and something great has happened and I just want to tell her about it. And I go to pick up my phone and then realise, obviously. And then sometimes it's because something particularly irritating and I just want to sort of vent. So I've got a lot of drafts in my outbox which are unsent. What would Jo have made of the way the world is just 1 year on? Jo and I had lived in New York together. We'd worked on the Obama campaign, and we saw the rise of Trump in particular with a growing sense of dread and fear because it was so obvious that what he was trying to do, the whole basis of his strategy was division, pulling people apart, playing one community off against the other, whether that was Mexicans or migrants or Muslims. So Jo definitely saw a lot of that coming, but I think she would have still been shocked that Trump won, for example, that the French election is as close as it's currently looking.
Europe and Trump, Brexit and Trump are the framing of current events, and they are striking enormous bitterness into the social fabric.
I think that's right. I think there is a sense of division, but I also think, and I think the reason that the take-up of this idea has been so strong, just even in the last 24 hours, is that actually there is a equal and opposite reaction, which is that this doesn't define us. How we voted on Brexit or on the Scottish referendum or the election is not fundamentally the essence of who we are. And for most people, that takes up less than 1 or 2% of their brain space. The things that they worry more about and think more about are their sense of community, their family, what's happening on their street. One of my worries is that we find a lot of opportunities to talk about the things that divide us, whether that be referenda or elections, and lots of other things. We find far too few opportunities to celebrate the things that actually hold us together, and we hope that this weekend on the 17th and 18th of June is one of those moments.
In practical terms, what do you want to see on the day?
What we hope is that people with their neighbours will get together and share food. That could be sort of huge barbecues, shared barbecues. It could be shutting the street and street parties. It could be picnics on the village green. It could be community bake-off happening during Ramadan, so there will be communal breaking of fast. But then actually everybody from the RSPB to the RNLI to the trade unions to the Premier League to all of the major faith groups, the Scouts and the Guides, there's just this huge sort of quintessentially British mix that's coming together. I think partly obviously because of Jo, but also I think that they all feel the same thing that I feel and that lots of other people feel, which is that the nastiness and the tone of politics actually doesn't represent our country, and there is so much that is better about our country that we want to celebrate.
Brendan Cox, thank you very much for talking to us.
Thank you.
Now, it's a remarkable statistic, but 1 in 5 women experience mental health problems during pregnancy or after birth. But when the Royal College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists surveyed more than 2,000 mothers, they found that only 7% who'd reported mental health problems had been given access to specialist care. Our health and social care correspondent Victoria MacDonald has spoken to one mother who waited months for counselling.
Pregnancy and birth is meant to be filled with joy and happiness and love, which makes it so much harder for the expectant or new mothers when what they actually feel is closer to despair and depression.
I guess for me, I just kind of got quite panicky and like my chest would get quite tight. I get quite hot and just kind of a bit flustered. And I quite often just wanted to escape the situation that I was in. I remember thinking I just need someone to help me. I'm not quite sure who or how, but this isn't right, this isn't me.
After the birth of her son 2 years ago, Emily Tredgett developed terrible anxiety and appalling insomnia. She was offered, although resisted, antidepressants. She did take sleeping pills, but what she most wanted was somebody to talk to.
From when I really asked for help to when I started actually seeing a counsellor, it was probably about 3 months, but that was when I got to kind of the point where I was really kind of shouting for help. I guess from the point of starting to wonder if I was struggling with anxiety or depression to actually seeing someone, it was probably over a year.
And today, the Royal College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists has released the results of a survey which they say presents a stark picture of maternal mental health in the UK. Of the 2,300 women who'd given birth in the last 5 years and who responded to the survey, 81% had experienced at least one mental health problem during or after their pregnancy. Yet, only 7% who reported their condition were referred to specialist care.
What this report reveals is the wide variation in services available across the country for mothers who need help. And it's talking about mental health conditions that range from anxiety to postnatal depression, from post-traumatic stress to psychosis.
And it does matter. Suicide is the leading cause of maternal death in this country. The government has committed more money, £290 million over 5 years, but the impact of that funding has in many cases yet to be felt.
More than 50% of the country, if we coloured in a map, 50% of it would be red, and red would mean no facilities available. So there will be some areas where women are looked after very well. There's one area in North East London, for example, where a really dedicated team of psychiatrists and obstetricians have really got a good network going. And I'm sure there are other examples of great practice elsewhere, but the variation, as you say, is enormous, and that's just not good enough for the women in this country.
Emily Tredgett did get her help eventually, but she's now developing an app so local mothers can find each other. Because, as she says, she knows what it feels like as you struggle alone.
Victoria MacDonald. Police in Malaysia have named a senior North Korean diplomat they want to question in connection with the killing of Kim Jong-nam. Mr. Kim, the half-brother of North Korea's leader Kim Jong-un, died after an unknown toxin was wiped on his face at Kuala Lumpur airport. Detectives also said attempts were made to break into the mortuary where Kim Jong-nam's body is being held. Kieran Jenkins reports, and a warning, there is flash photography in his report.
Just when you thought it couldn't get stranger, the North Koreans at the heart of this mystery have been unmasked. 6 wanted, 1 in custody. Ri Jong Chol. He says he's in the mushroom extract business. This herbal medicine company sponsors his visa. He hasn't worked there a single day.
Stay here so that we can maybe develop the mushroom extract business. Yeah.
But was his business really here at the North Korean embassy, now at the heart of the police investigation? One of two new suspects is not only known to the North Korean embassy.
What position does this person hold at the North Korean embassy?
He is the second secretary.
He's one of their top officials. Wanted along with a worker from North Korea's state-owned airline and others thought to have fled to Pyongyang. Police have demanded them back. They also scoffed at the idea the woman who pounced on Kim Jong-nam thought it was some kind of prank. A defence attributed to this Indonesian citizen and the Vietnamese passport holder Malaysian press are calling lol girl. In a farming village in rural Vietnam, her father seemed as bewildered as the rest of us.
My daughter is a well-behaved and hard-working woman. Did she dare do such an earth-shaking thing?
Well, yes, according to Malaysia's most senior policeman.
You know, what actually happened was, these two ladies were trained to swab deceased face. Wipe the face of the deceased, and after that they went away. They were instructed to clean their hands. And they know it is toxic.
A sophisticated attack, but also a bungled cover-up. Police today confirmed a break-in attempt at the morgue. Kim Jong-un wants his brother's body back. The more this mystery unravels, the more this secretive state is exposed.
Now, an apology. Earlier in the programme, I described Doris Day as the late Doris Day. She isn't. She's very much alive, and it allows me to say, que sera. Matt.
Que sera, indeed. And Storm Doris is very much alive, too. In fact, it's not just any old storm. It is a weather bomb. Not a name that we've made up to grab your attention, but a real term used by meteorologists. It is about to hit the north later, sweeping in from the Atlantic, where it has soaked up its explosive power. Well, what exactly is it, and what does it mean for those in its path? Well, our weather presenter Liam Dutton is here. Tell us more.
Well, Matt, it's the fourth named storm of the autumn-winter season, Storm Doris. It's currently forming over the Atlantic Ocean, and it's going to sweep in across the UK through tonight and particularly through the daytime tomorrow. Now, the main concern will be the strength of the wind for England and Wales. Damaging gusts of wind widely 50, 60 miles an hour. And for northern parts of England and Wales, as well as the Midlands, gusts could touch, in the worst affected areas, 80 miles an hour. So that's the potential for damage and disruption. A really difficult day for travelling tomorrow.
And why is it a bomb, a weather bomb?
Well, it's a technical term. The actual term that meteorologists tend to use is the explosive cyclogenesis, but it effectively means to say,
bomb.
Exactly, it's a bit easier to roll off the tongue. But what it means is, when you see a low pressure system on a weather chart, you may recall, or some viewers may recall, that there's a number that's close to the centre, and that marks the central pressure of the storm. And the lower the number, the deeper the storm and the stronger the winds. Now, for it to be a weather bomb, to undergo explosive cyclogenesis, it has to fall 24 millibars or more in 24 hours. And that's what Storm Doris is going to do. So she matches the criteria.
And we had a weather bomb in California not so long ago, didn't we?
We did. Last weekend, we had a weather bomb there. Amazing pictures coming in. They had up to 10 inches of rain across central and northern parts of California. Amazing pictures. Cars were submerged underwater. Homes were flooded as well. But I think the most striking image from California was this one here of the sinkhole that opened up in the road due to the abundance of rain and swallowed up a car. It's an amazing picture. But the important point is that that weather bomb is not our weather bomb. What we've got is a completely different storm. So the main concern for us, as I've mentioned, will be the strength of the wind. You see the areas sweeping across the country, with the worst of the winds affecting North Wales, the Midlands, Northern England, into parts of East Anglia. But as well as the wind, there'll also be heavy rain, so that'll give a risk of a localised flooding. And then for Scotland, it's not wind, but it's snow affecting the southern uplands up to 30 centimetres. So a lot going on, a full forecast coming up, of course.
Liam, thanks very much indeed. John.
After the break, the true price of free schools. The government spending watchdog warns that state schools are crumbling as billions of pounds are diverted to fund flagship free schools. Well, now, ministers are pushing ahead with plans to create 500 free schools by 2020, but at what price? According to a report from the National Audit Office, while billions are being spent on the new schools, existing state schools are crumbling and are not being repaired. But the former Education Secretary, Michael Gove, has defended the programme, saying spending is now more efficient. Our Home Affairs correspondent, Darshna Soni, reports from Nottingham.
So the dining hall here has been here a long, long time, even before lots of our parents here who came to school when they were children.
It's a dining hall that has the dubious distinction of being described as the worst in the city. Head teacher Sally Pearce gives me a tour.
It's really, as you can see, not fit for purpose. It's very cold in here in the winter, lots of condensation and moisture on the windows. It's not a great environment for the children to be eating their meals in.
And although the school is desperate to improve that environment, there simply isn't the money. And they're not alone. A report today by the National Audit Office has found that many state schools are crumbling, whilst billions are being spent on free schools.
So it must be frustrating for you when you read about how much money is going to free schools.
It is really frustrating. It's a bit soul-destroying for the staff and for the children here to be in this kind of environment when just down the road they've got brand spanking new buildings.
Seeley School was built nearly 100 years ago. Just half a mile away in a newly converted building is the Nottingham Free School. The Free School is a member of the Torch Academy Gateway Trust. They told us today they were unable to provide us with any information on how much the school cost. But the Audit Office has found that the government spends nearly 20% over the odds for free school sites, and that worries campaigners.
Well, I think the lack of transparency is something which is, with funding, which is something which is really, really worrying. This is taxpayers' money. This is for the money that goes into those taxes is for all of our children, and it should be shared between all of our children.
Free schools can play an important part in creating new places, but some are opening in areas like Nottingham where there isn't a current shortage. The Free Schools programme has proved more expensive than originally announced. In 2010, Michael Gove revealed a plan to open 315 free schools, costing £900 million. By 2015, 305 of these had opened, but the cost had risen to £1.8 billion. 500 more free schools are now being planned, costing another £7 billion, the same as the amount it would cost to repair all state schools.
This school was built in 1925 and parts of it are in desperate need of repair. Now, in response to today's criticism, the Department for Education told us that the government is making a huge investment in the school estate. They say £23 billion by 2021. Some of that money will be used for school repairs and some of it to create new school places. But a huge proportion of it will also be used to create 500 brand new free schools. What kind of problems do you have then keeping an old kitchen like this clean?
Things damp, going rust, like wheels, going rust trolleys, look. We have to make sure they're wiping and drying them all the time because it's just damp everywhere. You know, we've got no money, they've got no money, have they? But that doesn't help us, really.
And for many state schools faced with huge repair bills, that is the difficult reality. Darshna Soni, Channel 4 News, Nottingham.
And that ends our programme. Thank you very much indeed for watching.
We'll be back at 7 o'clock tomorrow night. You can watch us on Catch Up, on Facebook and on YouTube. But that's Channel 4 News. Good evening.
Good evening.